Hey, it looks like it worked.
Awesome.
Sweet. Hey guys, can you hear us? You might want to turn off your vibrations there, Via.
Okay.
All right, everybody in the live chat, can you hear us now? Sweet. All right, so sorry about that. This is my first time doing some hosting, so I had to work through getting Streamlabs up and going. By the way, I'm Aliakai. I'm the newest co-host. We've got Via here at the moment. Thomas had some stuff he was doing, and Calon's up in the mountains. I mean, like I've got some questions too, but we don't need to be discussing that at the moment. All right, so the topic for today, we were actually going to cover something that's kind of near and dear to my heart because it's pretty big in my particular community. I'm actually a Hellenic Reconstructionist, and there have been a lot of issues in our community in particular, but I've noticed in a lot of Reconstructionist communities with syncretism and people's practices, which, if folks aren't familiar, syncretism is the interaction between native deities and deities from other cultures that may be folded into the practice because of interactions with other cultures. So, the example that I always give is during the Hellenistic period, there was a lot of interactions between Egypt and Greece, and so Hermes Trismegistos became a thing because of the interactions between Hermes and Thoth from that particular pantheon. And so there are folks in the Hellenist community that deny Hermes Trismegistos because he's not a traditional Greek, like, it's not a traditional Greek epithet for him. It was a result of that cultural interaction, which personally I think is a bit silly because, like, there's a ton of interaction that goes on in antiquity between these various cultures, and that's part of how deity, the understanding of deity and religion, evolves. But there's also a related issue with multi-traditionalism, where people will take like a reconstruction and reconstructed Hellenist practice, and they'll combine it with, say, native shamanism from their own culture, and there's a lot of judgment and stigma around that. So I wanted to have a discussion about some of these problems that I've seen, and Via decided that she was up for it, so I will give the floor to her.
Okay, so in my communities that I generally hang around when it comes to religion, I haven't had direct issues with a stigma against syncretism, but I have definitely heard a lot of it, and I've witnessed some of it on Twitter. And generally, what I've seen is people uh, trying to preserve purity of traditions and keep traditions exclusive to themselves instead of mixing and merging them with other traditions.
Do you think that
And
this has, like, we talked about folkism recently, or you all did before I was brought into the fold? Do you think that there's a connection there?
us, I don't know if there's an inherent connection, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is.
I hope there isn't too much sound going on from me shifting. I've got some back issues, so I shift positions constantly, and my mic is oversensitive. I turned the gain down as much as I could. Well, I mean, I know at least on the side of Hellenism, I've seen some linkages between folkism and the anti multi traditionalism because of purity testing and things of that nature. Like, there are some organizations in particular that are very fixated on the notion that culture and religion have to be intricately tied, even for Reconstructionism. Like, modern culture and the reconstructed religion have to be very heavily tied, which is something that I'm willing to debate
Hmm.
for reconstructed religion specifically. So, but I think that there are some Reconstructionist paths that are a lot more accepting of syncretism than others.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not absolutely certain of heathenry, but I've heard that some parts of heathenry are more accepting of, like, syncretism and such than others, in part
Yeah,
because of the
definitely.
attitude that the Norse had towards their gods.
Hmm. And also, a lot of it has to do with the historic tradition of trading with other cultures, trading both goods and ideas. So religions kind of merged between the Norse and lots of other cultures. And it happened that way with most other cultures too, but they aren't necessarily as uh, prominently talked about.
So, Chris, we defined syncretism a little bit ago, but syncretism is what happens when cultures mix. So, the example that I gave was during a certain period in Greece's history, the Hellenistic period, you have the merging of Egyptian and Greek culture, where you got epithets for gods like Hermes Trismegistos, because Greeks were establishing colonies in Egypt and there was cultural trade between the two. And so you ended up with certain Greek gods and certain Egyptian gods taking on each other's aspects because of the way that the cultures interacted and how they understood one another. There's some evidence that this may have happened with Zeus as well. He was originally just a sky god, and as time comes along, went along, he eventually picked up some of the thunder god attributes from other cultures that the Greeks interacted with. And so you sometimes get then gods that are semi adopted into the pantheons. Aztecs and Mayas potentially could be an example of syncretism, yes. This is something that, like, the Aztec religion is one that I'm fairly educated on, but not the history. Like, I understand a lot of the theology behind it, but not the history yet. That's something that I haven't dug into as much. But like that's what syncretism is. Multi-traditionalism is the other topic that we're kind of talking about. And multi-traditionalism is where a modern day practitioner picks up pieces from various faiths and sort of ties them together. So it's not the same as eclecticism, because multi-traditionalism, you're observing the traditions of reconstructed two different cultures. So in my case, I am a multi-traditionalist to a certain extent. I have some native beliefs from my tribe that I practice. I was trained in world walking, and so I have some trance type states that I reach for that part of my practice. And I also have the more traditional offerings, prayers, hymns, etc. for the Hellenist side of my practice. And I do both, but I do them like separately, depending on what particular entity I'm trying to reach or worship, etc. So that's what we're talking about, is the stigma against those two things in reconstructionist circles, because there is a lot of attitude that is thrown when, say, a Hellenic reconstructionist starts talking about honoring Isis, like the goddess, not the organization, obviously. um, or Sekhmet or Bast or things like that, when there is actually historical evidence that these two cultures not only interacted, but that there may have been even mystery cults that formed because of it. So I think that it's an interesting conversation to have, and I think it's an interesting topic that isn't really explored very much, because the communities are so small and insular that even talking amongst one another, it's that particular population is kind of small. So, like, Via, can you give some examples of some of the stuff on Twitter that you've seen related to this?
I can't remember like specifics, but I've seen a lot of people call out people of their tradition for also practicing other traditions, calling them like, I don't know, just calling them general, not
Wiccans.
nice names. Well, yeah, I've seen that too. But
Yeah.
like I've seen a lot of insults get thrown around, usually insulting people's intelligence for practicing multiple different traditions or mixing traditions.
Well, and Rilla from the chat, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think latent Christianity does have a lot to do with that sort of puritanical mindset. I also think that there is a tendency in reconstructionist faiths to sort of try to preserve the past and fixate on specifically the scholarly interpretations of exactly the way that things were, so to speak, or the way that the person perceived things were. But that ignores how ancient religions, many of which have been around a lot longer than Christianity, evolved over time. Like, the deeper you get into scholarly work, the more you find that various gods change, especially with the interaction of culture, but also just with the evolution of the native culture itself. Again, when Zeus started, Zeus, for those who are not familiar with the Greek pronunciation, he was just a sky god, and a lot of his oldest mythos is in relation to that. But as the Greeks advanced and as they interacted with other cultures, he took on a thunder god aspect. And unlike in some traditions where the sky god was replaced by the thunder god, they folded together in Zeus's case. You see some similar things with Poseidon and Aphrodite and Athena. There's a number of different gods and goddesses that have changed due to the interaction with culture. You also see this a lot in Hellenic polytheists, and again, I'm talking about my own tradition because it's the thing that I'm the most familiar with, who deny any level of influence. Like, they deny that the Greek gods and the Roman gods have any relation to one another, despite the fact that a lot of the Roman gods were appropriated from the Greek. And so a lot of Roman rites and stuff are completely ignored. And I think that can become a mistake. I think when it becomes dogmatic, then it can, and especially if it's used for exclusion, and that's kind of where I wanted to bring this topic up, was it's often used for exclusion. It's often used to trash on people who do it. So, like, I think that can make us a fractured community. I think that the stigma against, like, mixing traditions when even when there's a historical reason to do so. And yes, I know that there are major differences between the Greek and Roman gods. So some random geek, if you want to talk about Zeus and, like, sexual stuff, we can. We might get the stream. We might lose the chance to ever monetize this stream if we do. But in terms of that, I'm not a mythic literalist, and I think the vast majority of Hellenists that I've met are not, so I'm going to make that generalization for the community that I've participated in. So his sexual exploits actually had a lot to do with, like, the symbolism around them and also the culture at the time. So in Greece, consent works very differently than it does now. Back then, women were the property of their fathers or brothers, the oldest male. And status had a lot to do with who could boink whom. So if, say, a ruler in a particular town wanted to boink a farmer's wife, he wouldn't need permission from the farmer or from her. It would just be his right. And so Zeus, being the king of the gods, didn't need permission from anybody ever, and neither did any of the other male gods. However, the idea of consent on the part of the woman was not something that was explored culturally very much, so it wasn't explored much in the myths. But the myths themselves frequently are about transformations. They're about sort of the evolution of various concepts. If you notice, the vast majority of them where he goes off and he finds a woman and he has sex with her, gods or concepts or other things are birthed as a result of that. Many of them are heroes, and Hera has a part in, like, bringing them up to greatness. And so when you look at that in a broader context, like Heracles and the trials, when you look at, some of the other gods that have been born, or nymphs or other, heroes that have been born as a result of these unions, the sexual aspect is not the focus of the myth. And, like, I'm not going to be an apologist for that culture. I think that obviously in the modern day we understand how barbarous that is, but the myths themselves are not meant to be taken literally either. Myths at least in the vast majority of the Hellenist view that I have spoken with, are meant to be lessons about us. They're meant to be lessons about humanity. They're meant to be lessons about our world. They're about a particular person's experience with deity, and they're meant to give us revelations about like how deity works insofar as like tradition and worship, but not insofar as like literal, this is how the gods made the world. This is how, we don't have the sort of tradition that Christians do where we think that every single myth actually happened.
They're essentially parables if you put it in like Abrahamic terms.
Yeah. So like that's my answer for Zeus's dick traveling the world, so to speak.
Mhm.
Okay, so Pandora's pot is a very, it's kind of a contentious thing because Hesiod was the only person who really talked about it, and it had more to do, that myth, I don't want to get into that without something prepared, because that's something that, because of the language at the time and because of the way that it's often misrepresented, I get a little heated, and I would rather be able to, if the collective decides that we're interested in it, I'd rather do a whole video on that in the future to be able to discuss it than do something kind of off the cuff when we're supposed to be talking about something else, if you don't mind.
Mhm.
Because, like, I agree that Hesiod in general has some pretty misogynistic takes, but with Pandora specifically, like, there's a lot more depth to that myth than a lot of people give it. In fact, I would say Greek mythology. I'm working on a series for on Greek mythology for Mythological Mondays. We may move it to a different day. We haven't talked about that yet. But I think Greek mythology is both one of the best widely known and least understood mythological sets, because when you start to dig into the actual core myths themselves, it's very different often than what people think of when they think of the myths. I think that's true of a lot of different mythology, though.
Yeah, definitely. At least with the more common ones that you see talked about in scholarly situations,
Mm-hmm.
like Greek and Norse and Roman, and sometimes Egyptian. And when it, I've noticed when it comes down to slightly less commonly talked about religions, like when it comes to Celtic and Gaulish or Hindu religions, uh, then it tends to be a lot more. The people who are involved in the people who are involved in it have a lot more knowledge on on the subject.
Yeah, and I mean, we can talk about like ignorance in reconstructionist religions, on a different day as well, because that can be a problem. A lot of people will start to get into a reconstructionist faith and they'll pick up a single book and start practicing, and that can sometimes be a problem. Um, but coming back to sort of syncretism and multi-traditionalism, I'm curious if folks in the chat, since we have a couple of people here, if any of you guys have any sort of experiences you would like to share with this sort of stigma. Like if any of you have ever done multi-traditional things, or if if you've experienced some of this within your own community, because I like to harp on the Greek community a lot because there's a lot of division going on right now. But the truth is, I've seen this across reconstructionist communities, and I've even actually seen this in some eclectic circles and Wiccan circles. Like I've seen various Wiccan sects who claim that their way to practice is the only way to practice. And, I've also seen trad Wiccans who state that if you are solitary and you haven't joined a coven, then you can't possibly be practicing correctly because you don't learn the names of the god and goddess and things of that nature. So I think that this is a problem of exclusivity of a sort across the community. And I think that it's something that isn't talked about near enough. I mean, I've heard it condemned here and there, but I don't think we've talked very much about the roots of it, or about people's experiences. So, has anybody here in the chat ever had an experience like that? Like, I'd love to hear some of your guys' stories. It'd be interesting. I know, Via, you said that you haven't really experienced it yourself, but you've seen it on Twitter.
Yeah.
The belief where you think all religions are rated, I believe that's universalism, is what it's called. Yeah, the Celtic, I've seen this in the Celtic community a little bit. So, yeah, it's known as mythic universalism, or soft polytheism, Chris. So basically, it's when people believe that all of the gods are either part of a single entity, or that they're human constructions that stem from a single source, or that they are archetypes, and that they are all pieces like of or pieces of a universal archetypal god and goddess. Like I've heard, I'm gonna pick on Wiccans a little bit because I've heard this most from Wiccan circles. So I apologize if there's any, like well-educated Wiccans in the chat, but this is just me being me for a minute. I've heard a lot of Wiccans that state that all of the gods, all of the goddesses that exist, are just faces of the goddess, and all of the gods that exist are just faces of the god, and that different cultures have put these faces order to in order to understand them through their own cultures. So that's known as soft polytheism. It's one version of it. There's another version of it where, like, all of the source, all of the gods are actually one source, and it's just us humanizing that source in order to be able to interact with it. That's closer to what I've seen for the few Christians that I've met that think all of the gods are the same gods, you're just not calling it by the same name. It's usually like, hey, you have this one source, a la Yahweh, and like, oh, well, we have some of the same values, so your gods must be the same. And for hard polytheists like myself, who believe the gods are all different separate entities, that can be a little bit problematic when you're trying to have a conversation, because in my experience, like worshiping the Greek gods, honoring them in in certain contexts generally doesn't get a very good response. This is me talking entirely from personal experience, but there is a traditional way in which to give offerings and things of that nature, and if you're overly personal, like some faiths allow you to be, like I was talking to Calon, and she said that there's a very different concept of like what honor and worship looks like in heathenry. Like that, for example, bragging about your accomplishments is almost expected in certain practices. Whereas, like, doing that to a god, unless you're specifically talking about, hey, these are the ways in which I've honored you, in, like, Hellenic polytheism, could be a sign of hubris. So, I think that mixing traditions can be... I think it can be problematic in that sense, but I also don't think there's anything wrong in particular with honoring a god outside of your tradition in a traditional way, so long as those traditions are potentially compatible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I combine a lot of my ritual and prayer under kind of a more or less similar structure. So, like, I use a similar structure for different traditions, but while doing that, it's also extremely important to look into those individual traditions and make sure that that style of prayer or ritual is compatible with the religion. And if it isn't, and it might anger the gods in some way, then I would like change it and adapt it to the deities that I'm trying to venerate.
Well, and this is where sometimes reconstructionists come into problems with eclectics, because like if you look historically at the structure of mythos and even the commentaries that we get about the way that daily life worked in Greece, praying to the Greek gods without making an offering and asking them for something generally was frowned upon, because honoring and worshiping them, we give them worship, we give them honor, we give them offerings because we love them, and
Mm-hmm.
because they love us. And I've seen that misinterpreted frequently as, well, you're bribing the gods to get what you want, and like you do that. That's not exactly how it works. But if you contrast that with other traditions where, say like Christianity, where you pray and it is through God's grace that you get your answer or not, like it's his will. Those are two, like, obviously the Greek gods, it's still their will, but there's a different way that you approach them.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity has done away with the idea of giving sacrifices and daily offerings in a ritualistic context from traditional old school Judaism. And so if you were to approach the Greek gods the way that a Christian would approach Yahweh, you'd have a very different situation on your hands, I think.
Yeah, with the Greek gods, it's kind of a sense of mutually giving something to each other and like kind of sharing the effort that you put into each other's like your relationship with each other. And from a Christian perspective, it's more of a sense of there's nothing that I could possibly give this God that he doesn't already have, so why offer to him anyway?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a completely different mindset for different gods, and it can work differently depending on what tradition you're practicing.
Well, and I've also noticed that most of the traditions that have syncretic links also have a tendency, with the exception of, I think, Egyptian and Greek syncretism, which those are very radically different cultures in terms of the way that the gods were approached. I've noticed that the vast majority of, say, European syncretic traditions tend to be very geographically close, and they also tend to have similar roots. Like, for example, people talk about the Canaanite religion interacting with the Greek religion very early on, and both of them had some degree of Proto Indo European foundation.
Hmm.
So that is a big part of why those two traditions interacted. Now, granted, as the cultures evolved, the way that people worshipped were different, but one couldn't argue that the gods would necessarily automatically respond negatively to, say, a Canaanite god being worshipped in the Greek manner, because there is some historical evidence that they could have been worshipped that way by practitioners who lived in the diaspora.
Hmm.
So, I'm taking a look at the chat talking about Polynesian deities and Native Americans. What do you mean by Native Americans in general, Chris? Because technically, one could argue that indigenous folks in Central America still count as Native Americans because you're still on the continent. So, are you talking specifically about like the Midwestern indigenous tribes? Because like my tribe, for example, is like it's not Salish, but it's very similar. Like we're from the same area. You count South American? Okay. Yeah, Polynesian religion is fascinating. Like, it is very, very localized. And it is. I think it's some of the more holistic. I think there's a reason why a lot of neo shamanism has latched onto it, which we can talk about appropriation another day. That's a tricky subject, I think, to try to tackle in a stream like this. But Polynesian faith is absolutely fascinating. Let's see. Transubstantiation with grape juice, talking about the Baptist Church. Yeah, I think it's really interesting talking about like sober offerings versus alcohol and whether or not that factors into whether a priest can transubstantiate it into like Jesus's blood. Catholicism and a lot of the offshoots of Catholicism have a very interesting history because a lot of those, as many people here know, I'm sure, a lot of those traditions actually came from paganism.
Hmm.
The Catholic Church picked up a lot of different rituals and such, and there is some minor, very, very minor evidence that the mystery cults of Dionysos may have actually influenced the concept of transubstantiation. Those mystery cults existed sometime before the Catholic Church ended up sort of becoming powerful in Rome, or whatever the early version of it could be considered. And there was a ritual where one of the Dionysian mystery cults believed that he died and rose from the dead, and there was also a very interesting sort of mythos surrounding like the gods being descended of the Titans and humans having this monstrous quality to us because of our descent. And so, like, there was this belief that we had to worship the gods in order to purify that element from us, which is very similar to this concept of sin. Like, the I'm trying to remember what the actual name of it is. Sins of the Father, the God, what is it called? Original sin. There's a very similar concept in Dionysian rites. So that if you look into that, there was a ritual where they would actually kill a bull, like by hand, and drink its blood and eat the flesh raw. that has some interesting similarities in ritual structure to later Catholic transubstantiation things involving wine. Also, Dionysos being the god of madness found in drink. There's a like there's a very interesting sort of correlation between the two. I don't know if it's officially scholarly confirmed that they had a relation to one another, but they did originate in the same area. So it's an interesting thing to consider. Also, Chris, the Gospel of Judas has been disproven by scholars and such to have been written either at the time where it claims to be or to have been there's a lot of historical problems and there's a lot of problems in the way that the Greek is constructed. So unfortunately, the Gospel of Judas might be a retcon, but as far as I know, it has been repeatedly debunked as being anything close to authentic. There are actually parts of the Bible itself that have been debunked as well. There are a couple of letters from Paul that have been debunked. But I mean, as fan fiction, it's fascinating, right? It's about as fascinating as the Inferno, the Divine Comedy, and Paradise Lost, for that matter. So, coming back, I guess, to syncretism and multi-traditionalism, funnily enough, I've seen this a little bit in Wiccan circles when they go after Christopagans. If you guys are familiar with Christopaganism or with the Abrahamic Trinity, there are some Wiccans and pagans that use Mary Magdalene, and the Holy Spirit, and Yahweh, Jesus, and I think Abraham as their trinities for the god and goddess. It's a really strange mix, I think. And there's a lot of garbage slung at these folks because of the incompatibilities that are, sort of perceived in those religions.
I've got to look into that specific branch of Christo-paganism. I've never heard of that, but I'll have to look into it. It sounds really fascinating.
Well, there's an organization up here where I live called the Aquarian Tabernacle, and I've actually met a couple of people that are a part of the Aquarian Tabernacle. It's a Wiccan group that actually use that particular set of trinities, and so I've gotten to talk to them a little bit. It's really fascinating. But I think that there is a lot of sort of rebelliousness there. And I think part of that is just the perceived incompatibility of these.
I've seen people who syncretize with Abrahamic tradition get criticized pretty heavily. But overall, I love talking to almost every person who I've met who's syncretized Abrahamic and pagan traditions together.
Yeah, and I've met a larger number of people who syncretize both Greek and Egyptian is the thing that I think is the most common, and Greek and Roman.
Mm-hmm.
Those two are the ones that I've seen. Honestly, weirdly enough, it's the Egyptian syncretists that tend to get the most mud slung at them in the Hellenist community. And I think part of that is because there's a certain portion of our community that gets very locked into one particular time period for the mythos. And they have this sort of puritanism, I guess would be the best way to put it, purist mentality where any interaction is no longer authentically Greek. And so that's something that frequently happens, I think. And that's part of the reason why people dog on the Roman deities, which again, my personal view on it is you do you, boo, as far as that stuff is concerned. But I mean, there's a lot about the Roman religion that existed pre-deep interactions with the Greeks, and there's a lot of difference between the way that the Roman gods were ultimately honored prior to Christianity sort of taking over. And there's a lot of ways that the gods were changed by that interaction, and also, the difference in name. And so I wonder if, I personally don't think they are the same gods. That's my experience, but I'm not going to dog on somebody who does.
I mean, at least not all of them are the same gods. There are some examples that are very, very, radically different than each other. And I know there's lots of similarities in other gods, and I'd be willing to like understand if they're the same as their Greek counterparts, but like I just personally don't see any way that they could all be the same pantheon.
Well, and again, there's been a number of both historical sources and modern sources that state, like the Romans are Greek, effectively, and so there's a number of people that will argue that the Roman mythos should be incorporated into Greek practice. I have a very unpopular opinion, and that's that you should figure that out for yourself, especially because the hearth cult is, as you would put it, the daily ritual practice in the oikos in the home is absolutely like the biggest part of Hellenic polytheism. That's your daily practice. Those are your offerings. That's your prayer.
Hmm.
And like the public part, the public festivals and things had a very, like, they were obviously a huge part of the religion as well, but they weren't nearly as personal and daily effective as the hearth cult, so to speak, was. And so that's where I take a lot of my position from, is especially because our community is so small. Like, there's not a lot of public rituals and things that are being done. I mean, there's the YSCE does some, and you have Labrys that does some as well in Greece, and you have a little bit, very, very small local congregations with Hellenian, but that's about it. And most people don't live close to any of those daily, or daily, or any of those, monthly holiday celebrations. And so you are left to prepare the feasts and make the offerings and pray at your altar. And I think there's something intimate and beautiful about that. I think that that's one of the powers of Reconstructionist faith, right? But because of that, if you then feel, and I'm going to use this term very loosely for all the, people in the audience that may not believe that this is possible, but if you feel the call of another God and you do enough research to understand that God and you believe that they're compatible with your practice, I don't think you should be demonized in the larger community for that. That's between you and your gods. And if you happen to want to talk about it, if you want to share your personal gnosis, I think that it's an unnecessary division of the community to go after you for it.
Yeah, that's exactly where I stand too. And to answer Chris's question in the chat, uh, Etruscan mythology is completely different from what we in modern times think of as Roman and Greek mythology. They were radically different gods, and I haven't looked specifically into the mythos per se, but I can at least tell you that there's a lot of difference between the gods.
Well, and that comes back to, again, we're talking a lot about Hellenism because this is just my area of expertise. So I'm sorry if y'all are bored. If somebody wants to give me some information on another pantheon that we want to bring into the mix, I'd absolutely love it. But if you come back to sort of the Greek pantheons, theirs was a wide variety in the various city states and how they practice their religion. Like the vast majority of Reconstructionists today use the Attic calendar, which comes from Athens, and a lot of the mythology comes from Athens because Athens has a lot of surviving records, and they have a lot of the folks that we study in terms of writers came from the Athens area or grew up there. And so the vast majority of what we have showcases the way that Athens worshipped. But there were local myths in nearly every city that frequently differed, and the festivals differed, and there were some deities that were worshipped only in specific areas. So, even Greek religion as a whole in antiquity was not a monolith. And it's certainly not today. Like, the various organizations even have different systems of reconstruction. You have the YSCE, which folds in their virtues for each of the lunar months. And then you have Hellenian, which has their monthly libations to the various gods based off of who the god that they perceive rules that particular month. You have Labrys, which published their book that I very heavily based my practice on, Hellenic Polytheism Household Worship. And they don't discuss the festivals, like the public festivals, at all in that book. They only have the lunar calendar, and then they have, I believe it is, God, give me a moment. I'm gonna pull up the specific name of the ceremony to make sure that I can actually pronounce it. Price. They have their full moon ceremony, and they have the Heliotetes ceremony, which is done on Sundays for Apollon and Helios. And so, like, you even have differences in Reconstructionist philosophies in the modern day. But most of these are, to some degree, about the Attic calendar. So if you wanted to, say, reconstruct Spartan religion, or you wanted to reconstruct, say, the. God, I'm going to butcher the hell out of this, so please forgive me, check. The Boeotian religion, then you have to dig a hell of a lot harder and find it, go a lot further. But that would actually still count as syncretism because they were practiced radically differently, even if they were worshiping many of the same gods. Some organizations actually fold some of the epithets, like local epithets, into overall worship, and that's kind of how they get around this. But that doesn't necessarily solve the problem because, like, Greek religion, much like many religions, was quite localized, and the universalist aspects of it, we can attempt to use them, but we have to also kind of give nod to where a lot of these names, where a lot of these stories came from. Have a good night. Yeah, Rilla, that almost happened to me, to be honest. Like, I know Hellenian has its issues, but I'm really grateful that I'm a part of them. There were a lot of, like, scholarly sources that I got turned on to because of it, and their education program helped me out quite a lot. It does have a lot of issues. Like, I take issue with the fact that they don't allow their priesthood to engage in public debate or discussion. Like, I have an issue with that. I also have an issue with some of the, like, the old-fashioned methods that they have for communicating with their members. But, like, some of these very negative attitudes and the sheer amount of footwork that a lot of Reconstructionist group expect you to do before you're even ready to, like, build your altar, while semi-reasonable if you're talking specifically about being a Reconstructionist, it can definitely turn eclectics off. And, I mean, I'm kind of mixed on that, personally. I am a Reconstructionist. I value that scholarly input, but I also think people are they're brought to the gods for a reason, generally. So I think that having patience rather than hostility is more important in the situations. I don't know. What do you think, Via? Like, I've been talking over you forever.
As an eclectic myself, I definitely completely understand being turned off by those organizations and their attitudes towards uh, people who are newer to the faith and people who don't know exactly what they're doing or don't put as much focus on perfect reconstruction. And I also admit that those organizations are extremely important and definitely should be there to uphold like the scholarly interest in the gods and should be there for the people who want to practice in that way. But I think that uh, there definitely needs to be an attitude shift of some kind that's geared towards educating people more than criticizing them.
Very much. Well, and I think that I don't have a place to presume the will of the gods. So I'm not going to tell off an eclectic who I
Mm-hmm.
meet who is doing some things that I find problematic. Now, if they define themselves as a Reconstructionist and they're doing some crazy stuff, then at that point, okay, well, you're identifying in my community. Let me try to gently have this conversation with you.
Mm-hmm.
But if you outright claim the label of eclectic, so long as that's what you're calling yourself, like, we can have a discussion, and it's not my place to presume that the gods are going to respond to you in one way or another.
Yeah.
I think part of the issue comes when you have reconstructionists who, for all intents and purposes, are practicing the best way that they can with the education they have. You know, again, let's say they picked up a book like the one by Labris. They
Hmm.
have some prayer and hymn books. They're using the Orphic hymns. They're making their daily practice, da da da. And now, suddenly, they feel a pull towards Sekhmet, or they feel a pull towards Isis, or they feel a pull
Hmm.
towards Thoth, or Hermes Trismegistos, they want to honor him in that aspect. That's when the dogpiling starts.
Hmm.
There is historical precedent for these things. Hermes
Yeah.
Trismegistos is an epithet because that particular aspect of him was honored.
Hmm.
It's very similar, I think, to the magic is hubris debate in the Hellenist community. And,
Yeah.
like, I've seen this happen a little bit in Kemetic Reconstructionism, and I've seen it happen a little bit in Religio Roma, which has a lot of relations to Hellenic Reconstructionism.
Hmm.
But I think that it's like, I think Rilla's right there. You know, it's not just people who are new to the faith, it's practitioners who don't practice the way that, say, an organization does generally.
Yeah.
And I think that there are a number of organizations that are just hostile to that.
Hmm.
But again, at the very least for Greek religion, and I think also for Egyptian, honestly, you see something very similar in Egyptian religion. You know, various cities honored various gods above others. Those like festival calendars were not identical across the entire country, or even like that. The empire existed for over 3,000 years. So, like, if you look at the length and breadth of that culture, there is such a rich, rich vein to mine there with historical practice. There's a rich vein to mine when it comes to, like what sacrifices the gods prefer, like what offerings the gods prefer, if you prefer that terminology rather than sacrifice, because, a lot of people say that, if it's not blood, it's not a sacrifice, it's just an offering. I mean, there's even debate in the Hellenist community as to whether or not a hymn, like a hymn sung in praise or a prayer that does not include a supplication, can be given as a direct offering. And I've seen people trash over that.
Hmm.
I don't see how any of that helps us grow our movement.
Yeah, definitely not. If there's not a specific historical source to deny a practice that someone's doing, and it's not hurting anyone or in any way, then the way I think about it is who are humans to question that person's relationship with the gods that they're venerating, and who are we to criticize how they're doing it?
Well, and I think that it gets a little muddier when you're talking about educators, when you're talking about
Hmm.
people who are creating content to teach other people how to practice this religion. This is where I think the debate might be not for syncretism or multi traditionalism particularly, but eclecticism. If you are publishing material claiming to be a reconstructionist of a particular faith and you're ignoring the work and scholarship that's being done and you're just putting your own stuff forward as proper practice, that I
Hmm.
think is something that might be worthy of having a discussion and calling out. Because at that
Yeah,
point, you are
definitely.
creating new material.
If you're trying to sell something as historically accurate when not much research has gone into it specifically, and it's more of just your personal practice, then that definitely deserves to get criticized and talked about.
So some random geek, there actually was a belief that cats were, how do I put it, psychopomps, basically, that they helped guide souls to the afterlife. There was also a lot of like cats that were considered sacred temple cats and were given offerings and things like for the temples at Bubastis. Um, so there is actually some precedent to the idea that cats were worshipped as gods, but I think it was particular cats in particular temples. I'm not sure. Again, Egyptian religion's not a monolith. I do know that that practice exists at the Temple of Bast and Bubastis. But I'm not sure if it existed outside of that. I'd have to do some research. I do know, however, that Amun Ra, in one of his manifestations, also was represented by a cat, and that Sekhmet was considered sort of a lion or a cougar. And that Bastet may have actually evolved from the softer side of Sekhmet, from the more mother side, rather than the like blood drunk, let's go murder everything side. So that's my answer to the historical precedent on that. Egyptian mythology is not my specialty. It's something that I'm interested in, but hell, I can't even say that I have an overwhelming education on Greek mythology. There is just so much there. I have read a lot of the classics. I have read a lot of scholarly work on it. I feel like no matter how much I've read, I've only ever barely scratched the surface. Like, yesterday was the seventh day after Nomania, as I'm observing it on my own calendar, and that made it Apollon's sacred day. And I learned about his relationship with the arts and how, in some mythological circles, one of the reasons he's a companion to the Muses is because he governed the passion for art, where they gave you inspiration. Apollon gives you that passion to then carry that through. And Athena, it ruled over the skill for some art, but as did Mnemosyne, the Titaness, mother of the Muses. So I mean, there's always so much new to find, and that's I think where I wanted to go with this conversation. I know we've meandered quite a lot, and we've repeated some of the same points, but the deeper you dive into mythology, the more associations you find, the more they you can, like, there might be in some esoteric practice that somebody is doing that has a mythological justification in a different Greek city and you just don't know about it. So who are you to presume the gods? Like,
And
whenever I
when
go
it
on.
comes to researching ancient religion, essentially the further you get into it, the more you realize that it's not one coherent monolith, that
Well, they're
everyone
living
under this one
traditions.
category practiced the same exact thing, especially when it gets to different cities, states, and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, some random geek. I completely agree with you on anarchist thought. Like, there is such a breadth of anarchist literature. Um,
Mhm.
and I mean, like, coming back to religion, like, these religions couldn't be monoliths if they tried. Like, this is a period of time where the vast majority of beliefs were passed down through oral traditions, and where cultures were still in the infancy of formation, and when they got into what we would recognize now as full-blown civilizations, you still have the fastest way that you could get word back was on horseback, written word. And this, in Greece, for example, literacy was a lot more widespread than in some parts of the ancient world. Though, coming back to the Aztecs actually had some of the very first widespread public education that we ever saw in the ancient world. They also had some of the most refined astronomy that you've ever seen in the ancient world because of their religious beliefs. Their calendars are actually still more accurate than some modern calendars today because of just the insane level of detail that they examine the skies. So, the deeper you get into this stuff, the more you realize that these were living, breathing, evolving traditions. And a lot of them, like the vast majority of them, in fact, didn't have some central book like the Bible or the Torah or, the Quran or the Vedas to govern themselves by. So there wasn't some, like, monolithic text that everybody referred to. It was a much more organic, personal experience with deity. There were stories that were memorized and told and passed down. There were festivals that were done out of tradition. But the deeper and longer a tradition goes, the more somebody's going to discover about divinity in the first place. And if you assume that the plays and the stories that we get from the philosophers were divinely inspired, if you believe that the mythology is divinely inspired, that it's supposed to teach something about the gods and us, that's a thousands of years to discover all of the different aspects of deity, to interact with all these different faces of these magnificent, near infinite beings, these, unattached, like unembodied minds that we can just barely begin to wrap our evolved brains around. There's something wondrous about that. And from that, dogging on syncretism and dogging on multi-traditionalism feels so petty and small compared to the vast reaches of history and antiquity and the things that we've lost because they were never bothered to be written down.
Yeah, I couldn't put it in better words than that. Like, essentially, there's no historical reason to completely drag down syncretism because essentially everyone did syncretize different beliefs from different cities and different traditions into their own tradition.
And the very nature of Reconstructionism, as I said, demands that you decide which of those beliefs from which of those areas you're going to honor. And
Mm-hmm.
to what degree you choose to honor any particular belief or pantheon might even just depend on what access to material you have. Like, I was
Yeah.
in a conversation with another polytheist recently because I'm creating my reading resources for the aspiring Hellenic polytheist, of which a very early draft is actually up in Ocean's Hold at the moment. But, like, somebody commented to me, this is very Athenian, and it's missing an entire pre Hellenic period in it. And, like when I mentioned, well, this is a beginner's list, I was told this is lazy, you're not helping Hellenism. And when I looked at that, my initial response was, well, I don't really want to overwhelm people with this mega list so that you feel like you have to read thousands upon thousands of books in order to even like dip your toe. At that point, you're going to end up with that, as somebody who I disagree with a great deal put it, armchair magicians, so to speak. Well, you'll end up with armchair polytheists. People who read about theory all day and don't actually go and show up to their altar. At the same time, the idea of how do you know enough about a god to begin to worship them? How do you know enough about a tradition to begin practicing it? The answer to that question is going to vary depending on the practitioner. And I think that if we thrust so much material on people before we even are willing to humor them on their experiences with divinity, on this call that they feel that drives them, because we don't proselytize as a rule, right? Like, people come to Reconstructionism because we feel called to, because something inside us moves us. Whether that's divinity directly inspiring it, or whether it's some part of the god coming into contact with us, or whether it's us awakening to deity, Platonists and non Platonists, we're all going to have an argument about that. I'm going to use the language call because it's the most familiar to a lot of us, I think. And if we feel called, if we feel this pull towards these divinities, if we feel the pull towards divinities from more than one tradition, and we find that in some ways those practices can be syncretized, if there's any sort of relation between them, then far be it from any of us to tell somebody no. I mean, how are we then helping our own traditions in that way? I'll let you open up because, again, I've been rambling. I'm sorry, guys.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good time to kind of open it up to the chat more and see if anyone has any specific questions when it comes to syncretism or what any of these specific terms mean, because I know that a lot of our viewer base isn't necessarily pagan, so some of these words could be quite foreign.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to open up to the chat. And really, you're right. Like, book paralysis is a real thing. I experienced that fairly early on. For what it's worth, by the way, I've been a Hellenic polytheist for about 3 or 4 years now. I was an eclectic prior to that, but I had some very interesting experiences with deity that led me to construct shrines and beginning to worship in a much more traditional way than I used to. So, I will not claim to be an expert by any means, but I am going to try at some point to start a series on basic practices as outlined by Labris and some of the experiences I've had with Hellenion for people to get started learning about how prayer works and like some other resources if people are interested in getting into Hellenic Reconstructionism. There's some fantastic websites. I'm going to try to do a series on that here. Syncretism is the term that Via mentioned, and multi-traditionalism. I'd have to actually run a search on that, Chris, as far as whether the Celtic Cross counts as syncretism. I know that it may have been, I think, was it adopted by Christianity at some point? Because if it was, then yes, that would be an example of syncretism. That'd be something from the Celtic pantheon that was then adopted by Christianity.
Anyway, for the people who may have joined later in the stream, some basic definitions for syncretism is essentially the joining of two or more traditions together and kind of merging and evolving a certain type of practice into something new by combining it with other traditions. And then multi-traditionalism is essentially practicing multiple different traditions at the same time, whether it be in a similar form or uh, kind of keeping different traditions separate. And
Or
uh,
honoring a god from a different tradition in the style of your main tradition, such as worshipping Isis
yes,
in a Hellenic
exactly.
way.
And that's what I do a lot. Like I have my personal tradition that I follow, this general way that I practice, and I tend to apply at least some type of like uh adapted form of that to most deities that I venerate.
Yeah, I actually do keep the two traditions that I practice mostly separate. I have
Hmm.
had some interesting experiences that very well could have originated with deity in trance states, not drug-induced trance states, mind you, but drumming-induced trance states, where I've had some interactions with Greek, like spirits and deities and such, or potential interactions. But for the most part, I honor the like native tradition spirits through my world walking that I have been taught, and I honor the Greek gods and spirits through that practice, and the two of them don't intersect a heck of a lot. Though I have given Greek style offerings to some of the main spirits and to some of my like totem protectors. So, I mean, it's to each their own. Like I'd probably be, you know, haha crucified if I shared that too much in my own community, given the way that some people feel about these things. So, do we have any more questions from the chat? We've hit about an hour now, and again, I apologize so much for us having been an hour late. I know that normally this happens at 6. There were some issues because Calon was up in the mountains and Thomas had a thing that came up. I ended up having to kind of throw together a very basic tech solution in a very short period of time, and it took me a little bit to figure out how the heck all that worked. So, sorry about that. Oh, that's interesting, Rilla. I did not know that. Roman sun deity holdover, huh? So, do we have any more questions from the chat? We've got 7 people apparently watching, which is kind of cool.
Yeah,
Via.
if we don't get more questions in the next few minutes or so, it's probably a good time to end the stream because I don't think we have much more to talk about on the subject unless someone brings something up that we haven't considered.
Oh yeah, like that's an iceberg-sized like grain of salt there, Rilla, for Wikipedia. Though I do think Wikipedia is a good place to start if you scroll straight down to their sources section and like
Hmm.
go into those. That can be a great way to start your research. But just like
I do
reading the
that
articles
a
there.
lot where I'll go on Wikipedia to try to find some basic answers for what I'm experiencing. And then once I've kind of like opened a couple pages and seen a couple of different like basic answers, I'd look deeper into the sources and see what's actually there and what's credible information.
All right, so if we don't have any major questions left from the chat, then we should probably start to wrap up. I have taken up most of the airtime. Hey, Ocean. Hey, guys. We have a bit of royalty floating around the chat. Yeah, Wikipedia article is not the end of researching. I mean, heck, it's not even the answer to a question. Like a Wikipedia article is grab the source, open it up in another window, and then find the answer to your question there. Because chances are, if it was like paraphrased, you probably aren't going to get an accurate answer, at least not in the
Yeah,
level of detail you
exactly.
need. And I mean, given the power that religion has, like gambling on Wikipedia just doesn't seem like a wise decision.
Yeah.
So, Ocean, for what it's worth, the vast majority of our discussion has focused on historical syncretism. So, talking about the way that cultures interacted, particularly Greek and Egyptian, because that's a really easy example that I can pull from history, and also Greek and Roman a little bit. And the way that reconstructionists, we can pull bits and pieces from history, but these traditions evolved over such a long time as organic things passed down, that there's a ton that we've even lost because of things that were never recorded in writing. So we talked extensively about, this judgmental attitude towards syncretism and this judgmental attitude towards multi-traditionalism kind of having no real basis in history and potentially no particular place in um, reconstructionism. And we talked a little bit about the difference between it and eclecticism. So, I mean, I don't even think that trashing on eclecticism completely is a problem unless the person in specific is like claiming to be an authority on reconstructionist religions. Like if you're selling a book and that book has a butt ton of eclectic personal practices that are not labeled as such, then like at that point I'm gonna have an issue with you. But like if you're just doing it in your own home, that's between you and the gods. Yes, Gaulish and Greek as well. Apollon has some really interesting historical stuff around him because a lot of people call him a sun deity, but there's some evidence to state that he was not the sun himself, that was Ilios, that he was kind of more the ruling deity of the sun's heat and power. That he also had a lot more links to, say, health and healing, and like he ruled over a particular time in a developing teenager's life. He ruled over the passion found like in an artist. He had so much from so many different places over the course of his history. Like Apollon is fascinating. Uh, Triatale, I think that's how you pronounce that. Eclecticism is when somebody does, I'm not going to say does preliminary research because that's kind of being a little disingenuous for eclectics, but eclecticism is generally where somebody does ahistorical worship practices, often for many different traditional deities, but they do so in an ahistorical way. So, and
Generally it's worship of the gods, but in a way that's not specifically trying to be historical. Lots of times pulling things from history, but also not being completely limited to that. And it's usually more based off of personal experience.
yes. And they are generally, like, eclecticism is generally a very personal thing. Like, there have been eclectics that started their own tradition religions. Like, a really good example is Aleister Crowley. He started Thelema, which was an eclectic, very personal version of ceremonial magic, Golden Dawn. So, most eclectists tend to value their own personal experiences with deity and their interpretations of those experiences with deity above the historical record, or at the very least equal to it. There tends to be a much heavier emphasis on one's personal experience and feelings than there is on the traditional practices associated with worship. So, like, Via actually is more of an eclectic, so I think she can probably do a better job than me explaining it because I'm a bit more traditionalist.
Yeah, I consider myself somewhere in between. I'm definitely not fully eclectic, where I kind of throw all history out the window and just do my own shit, but I'm not fully multi-traditionalist. And if I find something, or I'm not fully reconstructionist, and if I find something that works for me and that betters my experience and relationship with the deities I venerate, then I'm not going to hold back using that method to further my relationship.
Yes, and Ocean, I would add Scholarship also holds a great deal of authority in most Reconstructionist circles. There are some more focused, sort of leaning traditions that would disagree with me there, that would say that there are living traditions for certain religions that have carried through family lines and such, but I don't necessarily think that those should hold weight over historical period writings from a time where we know that the gods were definitely widely worshipped and there's evidence of this. Yeah, Rilla. So that means that you probably do lean towards eclecticism quite a bit more. So, but I don't think that syncretism and eclecticism are the same thing. Like syncretism, an example that I gave earlier is revering Isis and worshiping her in the Greek way, which actually does have some historical precedent. There was a time when those two cultures were interacting. So, giving Isis offerings in the Greek style, like in a Greek Reconstructionist style, setting up the altar, giving your offerings on the altar, and either burning them outside or, pouring libations and things of that nature would not have been unheard of. You just have to understand the context in which you are doing it and why you are choosing to do so. I think that sometimes there's a tendency in Reconstructionist circles to dismiss personal experience entirely, and I think that that's a wrong move. Like, I think
Yeah,
that.
I've definitely seen that happen a lot, especially in certain organizations that have a big emphasis on Reconstruction over eclecticism.
And I think that there is some truth. Butler put it really well when he said that regardless of whether the gods can be moved and affected by us, um, generally, even a say hallucinogenic experience with a deity, there's a very good chance it originated with that deity. We might just not be able to interpret it properly. So, somebody might have a vision involving Hermes or Apollon or, Zeus, and have that feeling as though they've been, called and they're somehow special, like they're the avatar of Zeus or the avatar of Hermes. And like they very well might be being called to worship, but they might be misinterpreting that as being the avatar of or being their, reborn version of or things of that nature. So obviously there is still an experience of being in contact with that god, but that person is, because of whatever blocks is going on with them, having a hard time conceptualizing that within a proper framework. So, but I think that part of the way the gods stay alive in the modern day is through these very personal experiences. I have yet to have met a Reconstructionist pagan who has told me they have never had a personal experience with the deity that they give the most favor to, or with deities or the pantheon that they happen to be worshiping. I mean, Via, do you have any experience with this?
I mean, it's almost universal in pagan circles, from what I've seen, to have at least had a personal experience with the deity to like point them toward worshiping that deity.
I mean,
I
sometimes the.
don't think I I I have met a couple of people who have started with like a predisposition prediscipate I can't fucking talk predisposition toward that deity and not had personal experiences until afterward, but in almost every single like every single person I've talked to about it have had some type of personal experience throughout their lives.
That's interesting. In the chat, Stephen Dillon, when I've read the case for polytheism at this point. When he wrote the case for polytheism, he apparently arrived at polytheism as a result of logical argumentation, which is really fascinating. Um, though he does talk about spiritual experience extensively in his arguments. That is definitely true. He talks at length about believing people as a general rule and about like how all of our experiences are subjective to begin with. Like every experience you have in reality is filtered through the electrical signals and like hormones that make up your senses. And so your brain has to interpret everything. So if a deity wanted to come into contact with you, that deity would have to do so using the biological hardware that you have. Like, there is nothing entirely separate from that, like, in terms of how to have experience. So if you have a hallucination, or if you have, like, an experience with the deity where you physically feel them, or a dream or whatever, the deity is going to have to reach you through that physical channel because there's no other way to reach you.
Yeah, I use that line of argumentation a lot, especially on Twitter, where essentially when you get down to it, there's that you can't defend anything of any sort, no matter how factual or empiricist, without using your own subjective, like human senses.
Well, and I want to agree with Ocean. Hearing voices and seeing stuff, especially if it's regular and constant and the voices are telling you to do things or they're saying bad things to you, that is definitely a concern. And, like, mental health issues in the pagan community is one that it's something that I think is being talked about in the wrong way in a lot of instances. Again, I'm pointing
Mm-hmm.
towards certain communities at the moment. I think that it's something that is being used to discredit what could potentially be very legitimate experiences without evidence of, say, psychosis, a history of psychosis. But I do think that there is a tendency, and at some point when we do our like woo and paganism episode, problems of paganism, the woo thing that we talked about, we'll probably get a little deeper into this. But, like, using spiritual experiences in lieu and mental health treatment is a major problem in the community, and, like, ascribing mental health episodes and stating that, oh well, because this could be, you know, inspired by a deity, well, you don't need help for your hallucinations because then you'd be blocking that off. No, like, don't do that. Just because the deity probably used that particular fault in your brain to contact you doesn't necessarily mean that they can no longer contact you if you get it treated. Like,
I
don't
mean,
think that
they're
way.
they're a literal god, so
Yeah.
it's not like they wouldn't be able to find some other way to contact you. So if you're hearing voices or seeing things like that, then definitely go get medical help.
Well, yeah, and, like, there's a lot of mental conditions that can, you know, like, they can lend themselves to these sorts of experiences, and again, a god could use them to contact you. Like, that's, I'm not denying that if you had a spiritual experience and you're prone to psychosis, that, it's suddenly not a valid, spiritual experience. There's a good chance a god had a hand in it. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to interpret it right the first time, if there even is a right way to interpret these things. It also doesn't mean that that contact is going to be shut off if you get it fixed, or at least coped with or treated. Like, it's important to note that the gods are gods. They have power beyond something that we can fully comprehend as humans. Like, that's part of what makes them gods, right? They're disembodied minds that are infinitely more powerful and knowledgeable than we can even fully comprehend. We can try to logic our way through it, but, and there's very logical reasons to believe in them, but ultimately, like, we as evolved minds are gonna have a damn hard time understanding these things that are so much bigger than us. And so, like, to put a limitation on a god, to say, hey, if I get my schizophrenia treated, or if I get my psychosis treated, or if I get my, severe anxiety or depression or whatever treated, well, I'm going to be so numbed out that I can't hear the god anymore. Well, that's nonsense. If the god wants to reach you, they're going to. So, I mean, like, I think, again, it's a huge topic, and we're going to need to talk about that in the future. But coming back to where it links to syncretism and multi traditionalism, those personal experiences can push somebody to then start looking at the historical traditions where that god that reached out to them, or that god that they had the experience with, may have been featured, in the ways that they may have been honored. And if they're close enough to the tradition they're practicing, again, who the hell are we to tell people that they can't do that? It's unless this person is then selling that, you must say worship Isis if you are a Hellenic polytheist, or you absolutely must honor the Roman gods in addition to the Greek ones in your Hellenic practice, or the Greek gods in your Religio Roma practice, at that point, now we're going to get into a fight, because you're then dictating what people have to do in order to be considered something. And at this moment in time, we don't have a central authority. We don't have central hierarchies for Reconstructionist movements. We have scholarly authority, but we just discussed the breadth of scholarly research. So if you're pulling from a particular time and a particular place, your practices might look very different than mine. And we can find more common ground with each other, despite how different our practices are, than either of us can with exclusivity traditions like the Abrahamic religions, if we choose. But we can also choose to be dogmatic, and I think that that's a mistake. I think that there's a lot of nuance and a lot of sort of consideration that one needs to have when having this discussion and when putting one's foot down as an authority. So, and I think also that lack of education, either for a new practitioner or for somebody who's a solitary who comes into a group like we were talking about earlier, I don't think that it should be a death sentence. And I think that people's patience with that sort of thing, as thin as it wanes, like, just because you've been in this for years and you've read every book on the planet on Aphrodite, doesn't necessarily mean that this person who is just coming in and, has only read a few and is starting, say, Athenic practice, needs to be taken down for that.
Yeah, I'm with SRG in the chat. If someone's going to tell me that I have to practice in a specific way, or else I'm like a heretic or something like that, I'm going to be instantly drawn away from that organization or that person who's trying to tell me how to practice.
Well, and sort
I
of,
mean, like if they're pointing out that there's a scholarly reason to do that, then I'll completely respect that and I'll look into it and possibly incorporate it into my practices. But if it's just someone saying that my own experience isn't valid, or that uh, their experience is more valid than mine, then I'm just going to shut them out.
well, and, I think also there's a dividing line between what you do in your own personal practice, your hearth cult, as we've talked about it in the past, and what you do in, say, public ritual. It's one thing to honor Isis on your own altar. It's another to demand that your organization, if you're a part of one, pour a libation to her on a particular holiday. There are lines to be drawn there as well. But I think a big part of this is also getting everybody on the same page with language. What is Kemetic Reconstructionism? What line does that have with eclecticism? Are you an eclectic or are you a Reconstructionist? Are you a Reconstructionist with eclectic tendencies? Are you a Wiccan who happens to use the gods of a particular pantheon in your rituals? Like, I've seen this extensively with Dianics. I've seen, Greek Wiccans as well, Norse Wiccans, etc. Like, from what point of view are you defining your practice, and making sure that people are using the terminology that best defines them, like trying to figure out that definition while you're having that conversation, and making sure that, if we're correcting people, that what they are, that they are even using the proper terminology for what they are without, being obviously like gatekeepers, can go a long way towards that also. So, again, we're talking about, when we talked about syncretism versus multi-traditionalism, we had to be very particular in those descriptions, because multi-traditionalism is technically a different thing than syncretism. Syncretism generally has a historical basis, whereas multi-traditionalism may not. In fact, some folks consider multi-traditionalism to be by itself always eclectic. We can debate that until the cows come home, to be honest. But, there is a particular school of Reconstructionist thought that goes there. Yeah, it's like herding cats in a bathtub. Rilla, you're absolutely right. But I think that being more open as a community to this kind of communication and being more open in educational circles, like here on Poly-Ology, getting that vocabulary down so that our discourse can be more open, in much the same way that our resident royal who's been lurking around has helped out the atheist community, has popularized terms like frith, and talked about the logical systems upon which polytheists can justify themselves, and the difference between polytheism and monotheism and exclusivity traditions and not, with the atheist community, so that we can have better discourse. I think within the polytheist community ourselves, I think it's possible for us to have better discourse by ensuring that we're on the same page when we're communicating, that we're being respectful of one another. And really, this stigma comes down to a lack of respect. It comes down to some folks deciding that they are the absolute authorities on things. And it's one thing if somebody is, claiming to be an authority and selling something and trying to, pass their stuff off, their eclectic, things off as being traditional. It's quite another if somebody's quite open about their eclectic practices. At that point, I don't have a position there. So,
We should
we're getting pretty close to
probably
final
start
thoughts, I
wrapping
think.
up. Yeah, we should probably start wrapping up because we're almost to an hour and a half.
Mm-hmm. So, Via, do you have any final thoughts?
Not that I can think of. I think that we've handled this topic pretty well and nailed down most of the points we needed to.
Yeah, I think we've covered a pretty thorough breadth of it, and also repeated ourselves a few times.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, given how many people came in late, I think that there's not really
Mhm.
necessarily a problem with that, but it might be a rough watch coming back.
Yeah.
So, thank you guys for having me. As I said, I'm kind of the new co host, and I'm really excited to be here. This is my very first stream, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to get some of the pretty stuff set up. So that the next stream looks a lot nicer. Again, I'm sorry about all the tech issues that we were having. It took me a while to get everything set up properly, but I'm excited to be here, and I thank you guys for hanging out with us and for having this conversation. And if you haven't gotten a chance to check out the Poly-Ology Discord, the link is in the description. It's well worth checking out. Give us a chance to follow us on Twitter, and if you haven't subscribed already, I highly recommend doing so. We have a slew of exciting new content, some stuff on Hellenism and Greek mythology. We've got another group chat coming on down the line about woo and about the problems with alternative medical practices taking over the pagan community. We have a bunch of really exciting stuff coming down the line. So if you haven't subbed yet, you really don't want to miss out. We've got some cool things going forward. And
something's a bit wonky with the description. I think that when we started the stream, it started a new stream instead of starting it and the one that we had already scheduled. So we don't have the links and stuff in the description.
All right, well, I'll go back and try to fix that then. We were having all kinds of trouble with Streamlabs. That's a bunch of I'll go see if I can delete the other scheduled stream if it didn't do things properly.
Yeah, so check back in a few minutes, and we should have the links up there for you.
Okay. But yeah, thank you again for taking the time to watch and to hang out with us for a bit. And yeah, I'm excited to be a part of this, and I can't wait to see you guys again.